admitting people as they become available. And so I'm Okoye Adeoye, and I am a professor of emergency medicine, and I'm also co-director of the Acute Care Research Council. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to everyone for being here. I have the honor and privilege of introducing Dr. Jonathan Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital. And he does research in Alzheimer's disease, and particularly is a founder and executive director of the CARE Research Center, which mainly is focused on ensuring access to innovative clinical trials for underrepresented minorities. And with that, I will stop talking and hand this over to Dr. Jackson, so we get the most we can out of him. Dr. Jackson.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you for that really warm introduction. And I always prefer very brief reviews of my bio. I work for an institution, Mass General Hospital, that loves giving people various titles. And it can take, half the time of a presentation to get through all of that. So I do appreciate skipping all of that pomp and circumstance so we can just get to the good stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. I have had pretty good luck at doing these sorts of things in the past. And so hopefully people are seeing my presentation as they should.
Looks good.
Okay, good, great, glad to hear it. So I'm going to be talking about the challenge of health equity in clinical research towards a quantifiable science of inclusion today. These are the three goals that we have for today, but given the nature of my work, I think it would be tough to fail to acknowledge that it has been a long and very exhausting week for many people. Even if you are not necessarily following the US presidential and down ballot elections, I know that for those of you who are interested in brain research and Alzheimer's disease, that the FDA is currently right now reviewing data from the aducanumab trials. So in a prior life, I studied mind wandering. If you can really only check in for maybe 10 to 15 minutes of my talk, I'm just here to let you know, I get it, I understand, you're totally fine. But for those of you who are able to kind of wave in and out a little bit more dynamically and try to catch a little bit more about what I'm trying to say, we're going to talk about the field of recruitment science, or at least the field as I envision it. It doesn't quite exist right now in its current form. And the reason why I'm here today to give this talk is to maybe talk about the work that you all do, maybe in the Q&A portion of this discussion and afterwards, and have an opportunity to learn, as well as share some of the wisdom that I've garnered from lots of other places. And then at the very end of this talk, if you can come back in for just a couple of minutes, provide a few suggestions to bolster recruitment. So I will try my best to be very concrete. So a few quick disclosures here. Part of the work that the CARE Research Center does, which I run, really involves very detailed, entrenched community engagement work. We do about 60 to 80 events per year. We haven't slowed down with COVID-19. And a lot of that work, or the bulk of that work, is supported by generous grants from the Otsuka Foundation as well as the Amgen Foundation. My research is supported largely by NIH and the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and I have been giving a little bit of money from Mass General Hospital, but trust me, it is not enough to lie to you about anything that I'm going to be presenting today. Before we get started on talking about the nuts and bolts of recruitment science, I felt that it's always important to recognize the origins of a field like this. So just as in my home department, neurology, where we really think a lot about the early days of phrenology, about looking at the lumps of the head and trying to derive some sort of insight about what was going on inside of the brain. We likewise have to acknowledge and understand that the origins of recruitment science are just as ethically and scientifically dubious. And it actually starts with a quote that I think is particularly relevant in light of what we've been seeing as a nation in recent weeks. And this quote comes from Martin Luther King Jr. at the end of the Selma marches in 1965. where he said, of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. And what is really interesting about this particular quote is that while equitable access to healthcare was a huge part of the civil rights movement, and we know that in 1966, most of the nation's hospitals integrated within about a 4 to 5 month span, he was also talking in part about this. The study of syphilis in the untreated Negro male. And when we talk about the Tuskegee study, we usually use it as almost like a straw man to say, this is the history of how we did research, but we don't do these kinds of things anymore. We have a lot more rules and policies and procedures in place to prevent something like this from happening again. However, what I want you to do is, instead of having that knee-jerk reaction, I want you to think instead about what Tuskegee really represented, especially from the perspective of recruitment science. Now, here was a study that for the first time really was thoughtful about exactly who they wanted to include in their research study. They were thoughtful about where these individuals were going to come from. They provided a strong set of incentives to make sure that these individuals stayed engaged with the study for decades by offering them free burials, free access to healthcare, treatment for what they called bad blood, which was made up, of course. But if you put it all together, the fact that they were able to follow a cohort of Black men, which are notoriously hard to reach in our modern area of research, they were able to follow a cohort of Black men for decades, as well as their families, really speaks to the origin of our obsession with diverse recruitment. It is the origin of recruitment science. And honestly, no study has done it as well before or since. And we have to acknowledge and reckon with the truth that the beginning of this field that I'm going to be spending the rest of my time talking about today has its beginning in a really ignominious history. And there's nothing that we can do to erase that. All we can do is acknowledge it and work to address it as we move the work forward. So for those of you who don't know a whole lot about Tuskegee, it actually has a great deal to do with the way that we do our research work today. The syphilis, this particular study went from 1932 to 1972, and the only reason why the study was stopped, because it was never particularly hidden from view, was because this was published on the front page of the New York Times on July 26, 1972. It actually had appeared in a journal, in a newspaper called the Washington Star the day before. The New York Times bought the story and ran it the following day. Now, when we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study as our beginning of thinking about recruitment science, we know that one of the truths that we tell ourselves as researchers is that we would never do anything like that today. And while I have a number of stories that demonstrate quite to the contrary, I do want you to hear from one of the study doctors who ran the Tuskegee study himself. So hopefully people can hear. If not, then I will summarize at the end. But this is just a clip from a Nova special. So Nova is a show on PBS that ran back in 1993 that was covering some aspect of the Tuskegee study.
One of the few surviving public health service doctors who worked on the study still defends that decision. John Cutler.
It was important. They were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin to treat the disease because you'd interfere with the study.
All right, so for those of you who may have had some trouble hearing the quote from Dr. Cutler, he's not sorry. He has no regrets about designing the Tuskegee study the way that he did. He said, obviously, we didn't want to cure their syphilis, which was easily curable by even the beginning of the study, because it would interfere with the study goals. And that is the point that I really want people to kind of sit and think about. How often do we have the same justification today that makes it hard to recruit certain populations? Because it would interfere with our study designs. It would interfere with the factors around convenience that we've set up for ourselves as researchers. The truth of the matter is that while some things have changed since the era of Tuskegee, other things remain resolutely the same. And for those who remain unconvinced about the importance of Tuskegee, there have been a number of other well-documented medical abuses against Blacks. This is put in small font intentionally because I don't want anyone to spend too much time getting lost in this story. I've given a presentation, I think it's available on YouTube. I'm happy to send it around if people are interested, that goes into detail about some of these other historical abuses. But the fact of the matter is that even if we're just thinking about blacks on blacks alone, not to mention a lot of the other disenfranchised and marginalized groups in the history of the United States, we as researchers don't exactly have a sterling reputation. And again, when it comes to the work around recruitment science, we have to do much better about acknowledging that truth. Now, it turns out that thinking about medical abuses, thinking about this history, of Tuskegee, of some of these other stories that are listed here, is not just important because of the era of mistrust. It's important because it is the foundation of the current era of health disparities that we see to this day. So I've got another brief video clip here from which is a joint report from Vox and ProPublica that connects this history of medical abuse to the modern era of health disparities.
In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
All right, and this last quote was offered by an author, Harriet Washington, who wrote a really fascinating book that I always recommend when I present this talk. It's called Medical Apartheid, and it is not an easy read, but it is a very well-researched, detailed look at the history of racism and abuse in medicine. And I think it really does form the foundation of everything that comes before. And I don't mean that in just a figurative sense. The Tuskegee study in particular was the foundation reason for forming the Belmont Commission in 1974. So less than 2 years after the Tuskegee study, Congress formed the Belmont Commission. In 1979, they produced the final Belmont Report. All of us know that the 3 main pillars of the Belmont Report, because we have to do city training and recertify every few years or so. But these principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, the underlying infrastructure for our institutional review boards, all of that comes directly as a response of the Tuskegee syphilis study. The last point, though, because we do a good work about respect for persons, we're doing a lot better when it comes to elements of beneficence. I would say that we're still struggling when it comes to this principle of justice, fair distributions of costs and benefits. And I'm about to jump into a bunch of examples that sort of speak to this. But if you're looking for a contemporary example, if we look at the difference between who is most likely to be hospitalized and die from COVID-19, and compare that to the relative diverse groups that we see in the clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines, I would put to you this challenge of whether we have achieved justice in clinical trials, even in the most high profile of situations. So let's talk very briefly about the policies that govern diverse and inclusive research. What are we supposed to be doing? And how is it that we are still able to fall short? Now, there have been a number of policies over the years, both by the National Institutes of Health as well as the Food and Drug Administration. I think most recently the FDA had draft guidance from last summer of 2019, that is, and they have actually updated and offered some limited guidance around COVID-19 vaccine trials as well. But as you can see here, there have been a number of policies over the years, all stemming from differing interpretations and revitalizing the principles espoused in the Belmont Report. But I think we still find ourselves to this day struggling. If you are one of the lucky few who has been able to achieve some diversity consistently across many studies, then surely you're aware that you are more the exception than the rule. But let's talk for a little bit, just a quick minute. Hopefully this is not something that is a surprise to many people, But let's talk about why diversity is important for research. Is this just a matter of social justice? Is this really, about us doing the right thing? Because people are people, right? So if you have one group of people or another group of people, then your study should be the same. It shouldn't matter. Well, let's take a look at the data, because we are researchers and scientists and people who follow science after all. We know that Ramamurthy and colleagues just 5 years ago found that 20% of FDA approvals for biologics had some sort of differential rate of exposure or response due to race and ethnicity alone. This particular study didn't look at other demographic factors, such as living in a rural residence, being somebody other than a man. But it's very likely that these factors may also contribute to differential rates of exposure or response. But these are FDA approvals. These are the biologics that have gotten through phases 1, 2, and 3. Is it really worth a roll of the dice, effectively, in terms of a differential response due to something like race? We know that not only is this problem seemingly omnipresent in our clinical research, but we see that it is seemingly worse in whatever therapies or technologies that are most advanced. So particularly in thinking about the future of precision and personalized medicine, we know that representation issues are tough. So we see that in cancer clinical trials. We see that even in the All of Us research study, which is supposed to recruit a cohort of 1 million people around the United States, and half of whom are supposed to belong to underrepresented groups. We know from looking at work in epidemiology that selection and survival biases will actually skew our estimates of causal factors. And I would submit to you that in the world of clinical research, causality is everything. You take a medicine, you get better, or you don't. The fact that some kind of selection bias in terms of not being necessarily fair or balanced or just in attracting people to clinical research studies, as well as differentials in who's able to stick with the study over time, if that has an impact on our causal factors, then this is not just a matter of social justice. This is a matter of rigorous science. This is a matter of not just external validity, but internal validity and statistical conclusion validity. So we've only got 4 big validities in research. If 3 of them are under threat by a lack of diversity, then this is clearly an issue that we need to take more seriously. So what happens if we don't recruit diversely? This paper was published by Latrice Landry back in 2018 in Health Affairs. And this is just a reflection of what we're seeing in our various genotypic and phenotypic databases. So pick your area that you're most interested in or that you're most affiliated with. And what you see is that we have a dramatic overrepresentation of individuals of European descent. Now, for those of you who are curious, from a global population standpoint, people from Europe, so not just Western Europe, but all of Europe, comprise about 9 to 15% of the global population, depending on how you count or how you carve up Europe. So we're talking, about 10% of the global population is of European descent. We can see that there are entire phenotypic databases that we see in neurology and respiratory diseases, that effectively have ignored large portions of the population. And more than that, we see here in green that there's a group that is referred to loosely as Asian. I would put to you, what do we mean by Asian? What exactly is that? But in the Landry article, what they actually go on to further detail and report is that Asian really mostly means Chinese. And it really mostly means Han Chinese. So when we see these Asian representations across these databases, what we find is that we're really talking about a very, very narrow subset of East Asians in one part of China. So what we see here is we do not have a balanced representation, obviously domestically, but also globally when it comes to the foundations of the future of our research endeavors. If we're going to be, powering AI and machine learning on these databases with this level of representation, which has frankly only gotten worse since 2018, then we're really setting ourselves up for failure. Closer to home, if we think about clinical trial approvals, this is a screenshot taken from the FDA clinical trial snapshot that they publish every year, early in the year. usually in January or February. And what you can see here is representation across the various clinical trials that the FDA reviewed last year. And what I've put up against it is the estimated US population at the time, late January of 2020. And as you can see here, if you can compare these numbers back and forth to each other, you can see, well, by golly, we're doing great when it comes to representation of women. We are getting close when it comes to representation of Black and African Americans. We are right on the money when it comes to Hispanic individuals. And we have a beautiful overrepresentation of older adults in our research studies. That's what you would take away from this. However, this is coming from somebody who trained as a cognitive neuroscientist and is very well versed in basic sciences as well as basic biostatistics. We know, at least we tell ourselves online and in our emails, that relying purely on averages tends to obscure a huge amount of information. So because the FDA only reports the average, I took it upon myself to calculate the median for the clinical trial snapshots. And what you see here is that we're telling a pretty different story. So we have wildly different estimates between the average and the median in our clinical trial snapshots in terms of representation. And what you can see here is that we are not doing nearly as well as we thought, especially when it comes to racial and ethnic minorities, and particularly when it comes to older adults in our research studies too. And just because I'm a nerd for funsies, I also calculated the coefficient of variation, which is an estimate of variability. So how big is the bounce from study to study in terms of representation? And the larger that number, especially when that number is in excess of 1, you see a greater increase of the standard deviation relative to the mean, which means that the study is much more highly variable. The collection of studies are much more highly variable when it comes to representation. So we're seeing large amounts of variability when it comes to Black and African American representation, Asian representation, again, not really sure what Asian means in this context, as well as older adults, where we are seeing coefficient of variations or COVs well over 1. So that is the early context of clinical research and research recruitment and the history of recruitment science. And hopefully I've established why it's important to connect that to diversity. But let's take a break. Let's step away from talking about diversity for just a second. And let's just talk about what's the best way to recruit people to a research study. So this is a fantastic paper published by Milo Rasuli and colleagues about 18 months ago in May of 2019. And I would highly recommend that people go and read this paper because I'm going to give you a couple of graphs from the paper, but they did a really, really comprehensive look. So this was a study at Columbia University where they were trying to get people to sign up for a genetics sub-study. So something similar to like a biobank or All of Us, where you come in for a baseline and you provide blood and you do a physical and you do a physical exam. So what you can see here is that there are 4 colors. There are individuals who were initially screened. Of the individuals who were screened, who was invited, who then consented to sign up for the study, and then who actually came in and provided that baseline data. And so what you can see here is that doing a battle royale of 7 different recruitment methods, you can see a couple of really interesting trends. First of all, those blue bars for biobank and EHR recruitment are really seductive. But in terms of the ratio of the red bar all the way on the right to the blue bar on the left for each of these categories is actually quite low. So they are seductive usually for people who are at my level, who are PIs of studies, because they see this initial screening number and they think to themselves, oh, if I can only get 10% of these individuals, then it will have been worth the effort. What we're seeing here is that in terms of the average biobank or EHR data pool, it may not necessarily be worth that time and effort. We can see here that clinic recruitment is a really to come into a study where where groups at each successive level are kind of closer to enrollment are a relatively large portion of the group that came before. But what's really remarkable, and it's a little bit tougher to see, is what's going on with staff network, with the different kinds of flyers, and with community events, where it seems like those numbers are smaller to begin with, but because they are much more involved, because they tend to rely on a bit more pre-existing trust, you can see that there's a relatively high percentage of individuals in subsequent groups compared to the group before. So because there's not necessarily a lot of screening or invitations from flyers, what you find is that you have to start with this level of the level of individuals who are consenting to the study. And then you see that there's a pretty high proportion of those who are actually coming in. Now, this might be tough to kind of keep in mind. So another way of thinking about the same set of data is calculating a marginal cost. How much does it cost us to bring in one additional participant using these different methods? And instead of just thinking about dollars that we're spending out of our budget, this particular graph also includes staff time as a calculation of that cost. So calculating staff time in sort of fractions of an hour spent on various phone calls for even one participant. What you can see here is ultimately biobank and EHR recruitment, even though it feels easy to us, especially those of us who are running the study, those of us who are actually on the front lines, I think probably know the truth, that it is a wildly inefficient method of recruiting. And it is very, very costly compared to some of these other methods that we tend to tell ourselves are too expensive. As you might expect, clinic recruitment is relatively cheap, but is it representative is the question. And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. So if you're trying to balance some elements of diverse recruitment with cheap recruitment, you usually don't necessarily want to spend too much time on biobanking EHR, but instead maybe thinking about some of these other recruitment methods. Now, they're going to come back to this question of diversity because that really needs to be at the beating heart of any recruitment effort that is sustained over time. And what you can see here in the red box is basically a mess. So don't try to go through and look for a pattern because there really isn't one. What this graph is telling you is that there is no one-size-fits-all method. There is no shortcuts to recruiting a completely diverse sample using maybe one or even two methods. The truth of the matter is that you've got to find different ways of reaching different groups. Now, let's talk about the recruitment that we're currently doing, the recruitment that the average research group is engaged in. And so this comes from my favorite paper of 2019 that was published just about a year ago by Carrie Gleason and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so this is a group of white and Black individuals. They self-identify their race, who have mild cognitive impairment at baseline. So at the left side of the graph. Over time, as you move rightward, these are individuals who will drop off of the graph as they progress from mild cognitive impairment to frank dementia. They'll have Alzheimer's disease or frontal temporal dementia or Lewy body dementia or something like that. And so what you can see here is that the line representing Black people is shallower than the line representing white people. And for those of you who may have forgotten how to read a Kaplan-Meier curve, what that means is that white people are progressing to a diagnosis of dementia faster than Black people, according to this graph. You might think, okay, sure, that's fine. I don't know much about Alzheimer's disease, but whatever. What is interesting is that this graph flies in the face of everything that we know about Alzheimer's disease, where we currently think that Black people are 2 to 4 times as likely as white people to have that formal diagnosis of dementia. And so you might think, oh, okay, all right. So the graph says that white people are progressing to dementia faster than Black people. Maybe there's something weird about this particular study. Well, it turns out that this graph represents the field of Alzheimer's largest data set. That's called the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center data set. There are nearly 3,500 white people and over 600 Black people represented in this graph. We don't have data that is more comprehensive than this in the world of clinical research. So what is going on with this particular graph? What's the story here? Why is it that with our largest data set of white and Black people, we are seeing a complete flip in the expectation of progression to dementia? Is there something that we're not understanding about Alzheimer's disease? Is there something about the people that we recruited? It turns out that if you actually go into the Gleason paper, they talk about something called the healthy worker bias. And it's presented here. And I'll be honest, this graph has always been a little bit complicated for me to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to this graph and I'll give you the punchline, which is that all the white people came from memory clinics. All of the Black people came from the community. And so what you're seeing here is not really a comparison between white and black people. You're seeing a comparison in the base rates of progressing to dementia when one group is coming to a memory clinic and is likely to already be complaining about memory problems, and the other group is just out in the community. They're not more likely to be presenting with memory problems in the first place. So this isn't white versus black, this is community versus clinic. So if you have people turning up to a clinic that is focused on memory and things like Alzheimer's disease, it's more likely that this is a group that will progress to that formal diagnosis. So we have to be really, really careful when we try these haphazard, half-hearted attempts at recruitment, because what that might mean is that we have conflated racial identity with some other aspect conditioned that is conditional on people being involved in a research study. So this is a weird result in a data set that is currently still happening. We don't have a mathematical or statistical correction for this, at least not yet. So we really need to be thoughtful about who it is that we're trying to include when we talk about diverse recruitment. So overall, just to kind of summarize, the state of inclusion science shows that there are lots and lots of peer-reviewed manuscripts across every discipline. The field is ultimately really, really hopelessly fragmented. There are a ton of confounds that abound in our research. You know, I've pointed this out earlier by saying I'm not quite sure what is meant by Asian. We can actually go a little bit bigger. What is a minority even when we talk about these categories? And what is it that we're trying to assume or demonstrate when we are recruiting minorities into our studies? Getting into a little bit more of the weeds, there are a lot of these terms that we throw around: outreach, recruitment, retention, engagements, and we tend to think that they're all kind of the same thing. When the truth of the matter is that they are all very different. And we should, as scientists and researchers and community members, when we come together, we should have a common language, a data ontology that carefully parcels out definitions and metrics for recruitment, for engagement, for retention, and for outreach that are not necessarily overlapping. But the largest problem by far is the virtual lack of infrastructure around doing this properly. Anyone that you talk to, anyone in this meeting would agree that this is an issue. Overall recruitment, of course. Diverse recruitment, yes. But in terms of finding solutions that are that respect the resources limitations that the average study team has, we're not seeing that. And this is yet another consequence of what I generally will call white supremacy culture, where we have a number of problems that should be taken care of at the system level, such as providing support for recruitment and research. But by and large, we leave these to individual study teams and individual research protocols to try to address what are effectively systemic issues. It really sets you up for failure. So the million-dollar question is, all right, Jackson, you've talked a lot about this. I understand that it's important for more reasons than external validity and social justice. Just tell me why we can't do this. What are the reasons? Well, it turns out that it doesn't really matter what field you study, where you go, what research articles you read. You usually come up with some combination of these top 10 reasons why it's tough to recruit diversely. Lack of awareness, mistrust, confusion and concern over the research protocol, lack of transportation, the eligibility criteria, things like language or health insurance coverage, limited diversity on study staff, insufficient return of value, so people don't necessarily know what they're getting out of the experience. But usually it's some combination of these 10 reasons. And so there's a few selected references here. I could easily give you a list 3 times as long, but you'd still end up with these 10 reasons. However, the problem that I've seen, and this is where we're getting into my own research, the problem that I've seen is that we treat these 10 reasons as though there is no hierarchy between them, that there is no way of necessarily knowing which one is present in your particular environment. And if you address it, whether you are more or less likely to see another particular barrier crop up. So what I have tried to do is try to map those same 10 reasons into a workflow presentation where you might recognize that bottlenecks in recruitment can occur at multiple stages. Earlier bottlenecks may manifest a little bit later. But the third bullet point is the one that I really want to drive home, which is that effective solutions have to address that earliest source of flow constriction rather than a later point. And so if you have a problem at the level of, say, return of value, and if you have a simultaneous problem in terms of awareness, if you just address the later one without addressing the earlier one, you're unlikely to see any difference. So the idea here is that this is a testable workflow. You can design a research study that actually tests that hypothesis. So what happens is you can actually take those 10 reasons and you can map them on really well to this workflow. So some map onto one, some map onto two, some of the elements of the workflow map onto multiple barriers, which should hopefully line up with the experience that some of you have had, and so on and so forth. And so what you end up having is what I'm calling a recruitment funnel, where you have these multiple stages. So you have this stage of thinking about your sampling frame, awareness, engagement, interest, return of value. And then what you ultimately have is this red box around the part of the research protocol that we actually fund, that we actually design for, that we actually have a plan for. And where we do not design for these other 5 stages of decisions, we tend to collapse into that first element of the study design. And more concretely, we tend to collapse all 5 of these into the point where somebody is signing up for a research study. They're looking over that consent form, and they have to basically catch up. They either have to develop a sufficient literacy or have sufficient privilege to effectively skip these stages, which is why we have so much difficulty reaching people who we have not previously reached for some other research opportunity. Now, a quick example of what I mean in this particular phase is a study that I have been working on with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for the last 3 years or so. So the MJFF has an online research study called Fox Insight. And the fact that it's online is actually really important because you might think if a study is online, if you just need a basic internet connection to reach it, you might think, digital divide aside, that it is easier to participate in an online study compared to going into a facility in person. You might think, I don't have to worry about parking, driving downtown. I don't have to go and talk to a bunch of people. I don't have to get lost. I don't have to deal with a lot of hassles of getting to most academic medical centers, which are in trafficky parts of town. So you might think, all right, this online study, we're looking at a disease that is relatively well distributed across the population. We should not have problems with recruitment. We should not have problems with diversity. However, when I was first discussing the Fox Insight demographics with the Fox Foundation, they gave me this data. And so if you can't see the categories at the bottom of the screen, I just want you to know that this graph is white for a reason. It was approaching 90% white, and it's more than that. You can see that the mode of the distribution for annual individual income is over $100,000, which is about twice what median household income was at the time in the United States. And we are also looking at a group that is very, very well educated. As you can see, although the mode of the distribution is on a bachelor's degree, we still have separate categories for master's degree, professional degree, or PhD or equivalent. So the fact that you can have three sort of post-bachelor's categories really suggests that this is a group that is not just highly educated, but also rich and largely white. And this is in spite of the study being designed in such a way that there are supposedly no barriers to participation apart from having an internet connection. So leveraging the same workflow approach, we designed just a very small pilot study focused on these first 4 elements in terms of improving URM representation. So we wanted to focus on multiple stages of this decisional workflow. And it was also important to us to have a relatively broad definition of what we meant by minority, where we thought about race, ethnicity, gender, and education, income, and morality. So we're not just talking about brown folks. We're really thinking about everybody that tends not to be included in research studies like this. We had a strong focus on what I call the sampling frame, which means instead of thinking about who's available for your study in terms of a broad catchment area or population data from census tracts, you think about your study, who comes into your clinic, who can access your clinic, and be thoughtful about who is most realistic to reach in a particular geographic region. So we ended up doing a study with 8 sites, 4 control, 4 active. All sites individually identified the set of barriers that they were hoping to address, what population they were going to do, and a specific intervention that they designed. And so we randomized 4 of the sites to intervention and 4 to control within pairs. And everybody did a 5-month intervention. We gave $45,000 to intervention. We gave $10,000 to control sites. If you're thinking this is not very much money, this is more than twice as much has been offered to Parkinson's sites to focus on recruitment and diversity. So this was a very large sum of money for the researchers. Interventions really focus mostly on addressing the community and interacting with physicians. This is unusual in the Parkinson's space because many people think of Parkinson's as a disease of relatively low prevalence. And so there is no thought to approaching general neurologists, primary care neurologists, or primary care physicians, or community members, because the thinking is that that's not where our patients are going to come from. But nevertheless, all 4 of the sites did decide to reach a little bit outside of movement disorder clinics. And so the pre-intervention launched last September. We wrapped up the study in mid-March of 2020, just as the pandemic was arriving on our shores in large numbers. And here's the punchline. There was a lot of data that came out of the study, but I just want to hone in on this. Relative to sites' own baselines in the Fox Insight platform, we saw no change in overall rate of accrual relative to their own baselines and through our study. But what we did see was huge changes in diverse representation for this. And so sites did not have to spend a lot of time. They did not have to spend a lot of money. But with just a little bit of tweaking and attention, they were able to really dramatically increase the diversity of their populations. And what's interesting here is that we saw this even with control sites. So even though control sites were doing effectively a passive control, where they did design an intervention, but they were not allowed to implement it, even just being, it seems as though that just being made aware of this possibility really made a difference in terms of driving some elements of diversity and engagement. So it sounds like you don't even, according to these results, you don't even need a lot of time or money. You don't need a complicated intervention strategy. It just sounds like there's something to be gained from just being aware of this as a problem. But what we see with the intervention site is that when you are given resources and a detailed plan, you are able to make good on that and achieve a really broad range of diversity for these studies. So what's really interesting is that the folks in the low income and low education groups are not racial and ethnic minorities. These are white individuals. So what you're seeing here is not necessarily a different kind of diversity, but really reaching a much broader cohort of individuals. So when it comes to thinking about what's next for a science of inclusion, a science of diversity, a science of recruitment, what I'm planning to do next is really going into each of these workflow stages and starting to develop and validate original metrics for each of them. So the idea is that we should not be powering our recruitment science for a single measure of accrual. At the very least, we need to be thinking about retention, and beyond that, we need to be thinking about independent or orthogonal measures of outreach and engagement. So I've listed a few ideas that I have here, like repurposing bias and confounder estimates for some aspects of this workflow. So leveraging the use of DAGs to think about our threats to validity, using modified values, modified E-values or floating catchment areas, and then thinking broadly about multidimensional network analysis, which has made a lot of waves in both computation as well as sociology. I would really strongly encourage some comparative effectiveness, and this is something that I'm starting to do with my own research. And then further and finally, examining this workflow model in other environments. And I think that if you pull this thread long enough, you come to a conclusion that it may be necessary and it may be a good thing to consider whether we might democratize research out of universities, out of academic medical centers, and bring infrastructure to do independent research directly to communities. The partners can be these universities and academic medical centers, but they are not required to make the research go. And so what you end up having is a modification of the initial funnel that I presented, where you pull metrics and validation measures from a huge variety of fields. where we recognize that much work has already been done in a number of other places. At the same time, if you look to the right, you recognize that there's a strong need to think about in building infrastructure beyond individual protocols and beyond individual study teams, and recognize that there need to be some systemic changes made in order to really support a very deep and detailed science of inclusion. All right, so I'm on my last two slides. I want to just offer some broad advice. So you think I've been talking a whole lot about this, but if you are struggling with diverse recruitment, what are things that you can do? The number one thing that I would recommend is to be thoughtful about who it is you really want to participate and whether they can get to you. So you need to separate your catchment area from your sampling frame. Second thing is to be thoughtful about implementing quick fixes from other sites. We talk a lot about Black churches. That works really well in one part of the United States, and it doesn't really work well anywhere else. The third thing is that you probably have an awareness problem that needs fixing. We have to remember that we as researchers are super weird. Most people don't know what science is, or at least how science is operationalized today. They don't understand what clinical research is. And even with nonstop wall-to-wall coverage of COVID-19 vaccines, there's still not a lot of awareness of what that means for the average person. The last thing that I want to say on this slide is you want to trust the experts. We as principal investigators are trusted because we are well trained in protocol design. And what we do when we are good at our jobs is we bring in experts to help us with parts that we're not very good at. Like we have a biostatistical expertise. We have somebody to help us with some aspect of community engagement. In many cases, understanding recruitment science means that we should rely on the expertise of our CRCs and RAs. That may come as a surprise, but these are the individuals who usually see the barriers up front and personal, or up close and personal, and they really understand what's going on. A little bit more advice, and then I'm gonna stop talking and we can start chatting. Use plain language for everything, including your informed consent documents. Language equity shouldn't be the problem that it is, but it's still there. But at least let's get English correct. Aim for a 5th grade reading level, which sounds tough, but it is doable. But certainly, if your documents are higher than 8th grade, then you have a real problem. There are lots and lots of readability formulas. If you do a Google search for readability calculator or readability formula, there's a lot of free resources online. Using clinician champions of research ambassadors is a guaranteed way of improving research recruitments, no matter how good, no matter how bad you think you are. But leveraging these kinds of groups really, really helps. Design for what's called a strong return of value. I highly recommend everybody to go and read Consuelo Wilkins' a really beautiful research paper published last year about designing for a return of value. That's the language that she uses. You need to think beyond return of results, make it easy, free, or fun to participate. I'm going to put it another way. We as researchers have 3 things that we should be offering our communities and our participants. We should be offering them time, we should be offering them money, we should be offering them information. You have to give them at least one. If you can give them all 3, then people will line up for your study, no matter what it is. But if you can give them at least one, then you're at least on the scoreboard in terms of designing for a return of value. And if you want to try to find a shortcut to community entrenchment, it's not there. Most models of this seem to suggest that sustained community entrenchment can yield results for recruitment, but it takes about 7 years. You've got to do this for 7 years consistently before you can really expect people to give you a return of value. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can open up for a few questions. But thanks so much for roughly a third of your attention over the last 50 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much for really an informative presentation. And really, again, I want to reiterate that we very much appreciate your time in joining us today. And so I see that there are comments coming into the chat room. If you could also speak, but I worry about what we're getting right now, which is a lot of feedback already.
This is Carrie Roundtree. I think you unmuted me. If you want me, I can just read my question, or I can mute back.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for a great presentation. I will paraphrase what I put in the chat. So I love all of the advice about reaching the communities and researching the communities. I wondered a more specific question. What would your advice be for a couple of white researchers to take the first step towards this in obtaining funding? Like, how do we write this up feasibly and so it makes sense to reviewers that might not be familiar with the problem?
First of all, y'all need to hire more diverse CRCs.
I agree.
Yes.
I agree. And if I was in charge of that, I would do that. And then the second part of the question is maybe already been answered by whoever chimed in, was starting to nudge the culture of academic units that we're a part of to start to see this as a regular thing in grant applications and even professional planning. Thank you.
So I think that when all else fails, we should absolutely be aiming for diversity. But I recognize that a lot of people find that a little bit difficult. So if that is difficult, if you just can't, really should be able to. It looks like I'm muted.
No. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. I saw a little muted sign. Anyways, so part of the challenge I think some people feel is finding those candidates. The fact of the matter is that those candidates are not actually hard to find. We've just built a culture that has made them invisible to us. So you have to acknowledge that first and foremost. So let's just say that you can't find anybody. The first thing that you got to do, well, there's a few things that you got to do. The first thing that you got to do is you got to think about who it is that you want in your study. And so that will help you determine who it is that you need represented on your study staff. And I don't just mean we need people of color, or I don't just mean we need brown people or black people. Be specific. There is no group in America that is a monolith. And I hope that we are understanding that this week of all weeks, that you can't just say, I want somebody black on my study. So, a really clear example of this is that I'm black, as you can see, even though there's a lot of bright sunlight, but I'm from Texas. I currently live and work in Boston. And so while I have been able to make some inroads into the Black community in Boston, it really wasn't until I hired someone local, someone who was from a Boston suburb, that I was really able to make a huge amounts of headway in terms of our community events and in terms of recruitment to research studies. So don't just think about diverse, think about local and think specifically about who you want. And then once you have done that, going out and working very closely with community leaders, not just in terms of partnering with you as a funnel to recruitment, but partnering with them on engagement and especially on hiring individuals into your studies is a really great way of moving that forward. If you're worried about money, I would really encourage you, especially if you have NIH funding, to think carefully about leveraging the administrative supplement program. So the admin supplements can be used for a very huge range of NIH mechanisms, and usually you can leverage those funds to dedicate funding for diversifying your research participants, for hiring somebody at the CRC level, all the way up to a protected fraction of an effort of somebody who's at the faculty level to help you with this. Now, more concretely and more specifically, because I know that we're running out of time, please reach out to me directly. I'm everywhere. I spend a lot of time on Twitter and on email. So we offer free consultations. We're only supposed to offer it to Mass General people, but y'all are family, so we'll do it for free. So we'll give you 6 free hours of time to help you map out a very detailed plan, including obtaining funding. But I will agree with whoever chimed in earlier. You really do need to think about the local community and involve them as much as possible.
Thank you very much again for the comments and questions. Just for everyone, this is recorded. I hope everyone is aware of that. And we will look at these questions, and if we don't get a chance to address them, we'll have Dr. Jackson, we'll get his permission, we'll share the slides if he lets us, and so on and so forth. And so we'll get to these things just after the hour is up. We do have 5 more minutes, so another question. Somebody's asking what your Twitter handle is, Jonathan, and that may be an easy, quick answer.
Yeah, actually, I think somebody actually dropped it into the chat, so somebody knows who I am on Twitter. So it's at eGally, E-G-A-L-Y. And so if you can't find my email, if you can't find me anywhere else, send me a tweet or a DM, and I promise that if you're having trouble, I can help you.
Dr. Jackson, would it be okay
Yes.
to share the presentation because
Yeah,
everyone has been mentioning? Okay, great.
Yes.
I do have that, and I do have everyone's registration, so I'm happy to send that to everyone. The recording of the presentation will be shared online, so I will send out an email to everyone letting them know when it's ready and the slides. More questions?
I see a question in the chat about, do I see a role here for IRBs? Absolutely. So I really think that we need to think very carefully about how we are leveraging IRBs in the research process. So in particular, in how we're stacking those IRBs, we need to have more community members in general, and we need to make sure that those community members are from local areas wherever possible. So that means rethinking the way that we staff IRBs, how we compensate, how we train, and offering IRB membership or the opportunity to review protocols as a true incentive for engaging with these populations. We should not be offering research studies with the only option as being a participant in a study. We need to make sure that they have opportunities to serve on community advisory boards and IRBs as well.
So Jonathan, just a follow up to that, I did see that question. Sorry, I missed it to whomever sent it earlier. What about the overall shift towards central IRBs? And, you know, this comments you just made about making sure there's local representation. The flip side to that is at the federal level, there's a lot of shift and push towards a central IRB process for efficiency. What are the implications of that?
Yeah, so if you don't have control over the review board, so let's say that you are a hub or a spoke or you are a co-investigator, then you definitely want to push for the home institution to have representation on their IRB. Failing that, then they need to have a very active and involved community advisory board at the central level. And I think you also need one at the local level. So definitely push for some additional funds to pay those individuals because they are offering expertise. Again, an administrative supplement and talking to your local program officer is a really, really great way to get extra money if you feel like that your budget just can't handle it otherwise.
Well, again, on behalf of all of us, if I may, thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. This has been illuminating, to say the least. And again, we really, really appreciate your time and efforts. And for those of us who will be in the special time with you in the